Hey everybody, so I want to continue on with 3B. The last time we talked in the previous video, we ended on the Proclamation Act of 1763. So that's just one of the things that England is going to do to end salutary neglect and start enforcing laws again in the colonies after the French and Indian War. Most of you know about the acts that are going to be put in place in order to collect taxes. I'm sure you've heard of the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act and all of those different ones, but I wanted you to take a look at this specifically, the Sugar Act. They're going to pass this to cover the cost of their protection. So one of the reasons England is going to tax the colonies is because they have to send troops over there to protect them from the Native Americans and keep order in the colonies. And they're saying, hey, look, you got to pay for this service of having these troops over there. So that's one of the reasons why they tax sugar. And when we say sugar, don't think about the white stuff you buy in the, your mom buys in the sacks at the grocery store. This was actually a tax on the importation of molasses. And molasses was a key ingredient in making rum. So back during the colonial times, most people didn't drink water, all right, because you never could be sure your water supply was sanitary. So people drank things like ale and rum and wine and different things that had been fermented and kind of cooked. So they taxed the importation of molasses because it was that key ingredient in making rum. They also had to pay for a new court system because we talked about in the colonies how the colonists would smuggle goods in and out, right? To make a little money, to make some more money or to get products that people wanted that England wasn't selling to them. And that was a real problem. So once England starts enforcing the laws again, they realize they're going to have to deal with the smugglers. So they create these courts where they are not governed by the colonists, but they're governed by England, right? And so now that's going to make the colonies mad as well. But the tax that's really going to affect the majority of colonists is going to be the Stamp Act, okay? And I want you to take a look at this. This is somebody who wrote a letter. This guy was actually one of the signers of, was not a signer of the Declaration of Independence, but he was on the committee, on the Continental Congress. He was a Quaker. John Dickinson was in Pennsylvania, so he didn't believe in war, right? And he writes this letter after the Stamp Act is passed. And basically the Stamp Act impacted anybody who dealt with paper. If you bought a deck of playing cards, or you had to have a contract signed, or you got married and had a marriage certificate, or you had anything that involved putting something on paper, you basically were taxed for that paper. And John Dickinson writes this article or this pamphlet and sends it out. And if you'll notice in the highlights section, it talks about virtuous indignation, right? That means, look, England, mother country, we love you. We know you're your subjects. We want to have a good relationship with you. But this idea of taxing us without representation is really causing us to get upset. So you really need to think about, how this affects all of us, and you need to go ahead and get rid of this Stamp Act. So John Dickinson, completely opposite from the way the Sons of Liberty would have responded, right? They're going to go tar and feather somebody. John Dickinson is trying to maintain this relationship with England and saying, look, you guys need to do the right thing and get rid of this Stamp Act, right? We talked about the committees of correspondence. I just wanted to show you this slide really quickly where it talks about the purpose of the committee is to communicate with the other colonies. So if they've got concerns, then they can communicate effectively with each other and let each other know what's going on. If one group is going to protest, then the other group can decide to do that as well. And then you've got the more pot-stirring group, the Sons of Liberty in Boston, that are rioting, that sometimes it turns violent, the tarring and the feathering, and they are going to try to stop the ships that are carrying the stamps from coming into port to prevent them from taxing the colonists. Real quick, I wanted to talk about the Daughters of Liberty. So women played a role in this whole idea of, we're going against this idea of taxation without representation. So the thing that women did was they would boycott textiles or fabric that would come in to the colonies from England. Okay, so instead of buying English fabric to make clothing, they would spin their own wool or their own, whatever, and they would make their own clothes and boycott the ones coming in from England. So that's kind of what the Daughters of Liberty did. Now, most of you know about the Boston Massacre, and you know what happens during the Boston Tea Party. But what you may not know is after the Boston Tea Party happens, the King of England tries to use the city of Boston as an example to all the other colonies. And he passes what's called the Intolerable Acts. And basically what the Intolerable Act says, and that's what England called them. I'm sorry, that's what the colonies called them, was the Intolerable Acts. England called them the Coercive Acts, but it's the same thing. But England comes back after the Boston Tea Party, after, hundreds and thousands of dollars of tea is ruined by throwing it overboard. And they say, look, Boston, we're making an example of you. We're going to close your harbor, okay? And the only ships that can pass through are British ships. We are not going to allow any goods or merchandise to come into your harbor until you pay the debt you owe us. On top of that, we are going to quarter British soldiers in your home, and you're going to be responsible for feeding them and housing them, okay? All trials are now going to be held in England. You're not going to be able to hold your own trials anymore, and a couple of other things. So they really take a hard line with Boston and try to use them as an example, okay, with the Intolerable Acts. So if you go back and you review, you can look at what happens after the French and Indian War. You can look and see what happens with the Proclamation Act and whether or not that is followed, right? And whether or not England can enforce it. And then you look at England starting to tax the colonies through the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act and different things like that, and groups that are going to form as a result of that to protest and boycott, okay? And if you want, I wanted to give you this little chart as well so you can take a look at that. So hopefully that explains some of the responses of the colonists after the French and Indian War and leading up to the American Revolution.